In the dead of night, when the moon is high and ill winds blow, and the banshees cry and the moonlight casts an unearthly glow, arise, my love, with tales of woe.
Good evening. It is 12 midnight, the paranormal hour. Welcome to Ghost to Ghost. I'm your host, Chief Lawson. Ghost to Ghost is a podcast to discuss all paranormal and parapsychology subjects. You can find Ghost to Ghost on all major formats, so tell your friends, tell your family. Come listen to Ghost to Ghost.
Hello, folks. It's once again that midnight hour. Welcome to Ghost, and welcome to Season 3. We are on the Big 3, and this is Episode 1. Welcome to the new year. Happy New Year to all of our listeners. Tonight's subject, we're going to talk about the Hanna House, one of Hoosier's most famous haunted locations. Tonight with me, I have Jennifer Verne, our research manager and podcast producer.
Good evening.
And Heather Lawson, our case manager and podcast director.
Hello.
This is a portion of our upcoming series this year on haunted locations in Indiana. And the Hanna House is one that's been around for a long time and one of the most famous places. If you pick up a book on Indiana ghosts, more than likely you're going to find the Hanna House as one of those chapters. And it has a really interesting history. So I'm going to let Jennifer start us out a bit on the history, and then we'll go from there.
Okay. The Hanna House was built by Alexander Hanna. He was born 1812. He started his life as a harness maker, and then he actually got gold fever. So he went to California for the gold rush, made some money out there, and there's reports that he was actually part owner of a ranch out there, vegetable ranch. Was maybe there for 5 years is what I've seen.
Yeah.
Sold off his portion and came back to Indiana, where his father Samuel was residing here still. Samuel was kind of a big name, especially in Wayne County, and then he moved over into Marion County. He was the president of the Indiana Central Railroad, and so Alexander went to work for the railroad. He bought acreage on the south side of Indianapolis. There are conflicting reports as to how much he started with, some around 210, 240.
Yes.
By the time he died, he ended up with 350 acres. So,
Wow.
But in 1858, he built the Hanna House, as it would come to be known. Although during his lifetime, it was either called Mapleton or Maplewood. The obit for his wife, Elizabeth, his future wife, Elizabeth, says Mapleton. But on his obit, it says Maplewood. It was a working farmstead. They had crops and livestock, wheat, hay, corn, cattle, pigs, that sort of thing. But in addition to the farm, he also, and the railroad,
Yes.
he also had his hands, so they say, in local community posts on the south side.
Yes.
So what we have read in recent accounts of Mr. Hanna is that he was a strict Quaker. He was postmaster on the south side, sheriff, circuit court clerk, and a member of the Indiana General Assembly.
Yes.
Now, this is according to an article that I'll reference later on as well about the house in 1966.
Mm-hmm.
However, in an article in 1859 about his death, so this isn't his obit, because his
Yes.
obit was 2 sentences.
Wow.
2 sentences.
That's it.
That's it.
Oh, goodness.
There was an article, though, about him passing, and in that article, it says that he had never had any connection to one church, and it doesn't mention any of those positions at all.
Yeah, that's an odd thing with him because a lot of this stuff is hard to prove with him.
Right, but what it does talk about is his father,
Yes.
Samuel,
Mm-hmm.
had those connections. Samuel seemed to be greatly talked about in the paper. Like, the article was half about Alexander, and then the second half was about Samuel and all of
Yes.
his accomplishments.
Yes.
And Samuel was listed as part of the General Assembly and postmaster and things like
Yes.
that. So it's possible that the two guys, their history is getting merged and overlapped.
Yeah, it could be. There is a plaque down at the state office, but I remember seeing it, that's dedicated to Samuel. I've never seen it, and
okay.
there's one that's, and there's one that's dedicated to Alexander.
Yeah.
So I don't know. That could be. I mean,
Now, when you Google in newspapers.com Alexander Hanna,
yes,
you get very little articles.
yes,
When you Google the second owner we're going to talk about later, you get a lot of articles.
yes.
So the only time Hanna comes up in the paper during his lifetime is for purchase of land. So you
Yes.
can see all the times he's buying up land.
Transactions.
But he's never having events at his house, even after he gets married. You don't see such and such soiree was held at the
Sure, which
Mapleton.
is common for people that were that well
Very common.
involved in all the, especially the symbols.
There's a whole section of these newspapers where Mr. So-and-so went to have dinner at Mrs. So-and-so's house,
Yeah.
whatever. So-and-so came in from Plainfield to stay with his sister in Indianapolis this
Yes.
weekend. The Hannas, even after he got married to Elizabeth, are not mentioned in the newspaper like that.
Yes.
So that would indicate that he was a very private, very quiet man. And again, the article says that he did not have a connection to one church. So the fact that they say later on, half a century later, that he was a strict Quaker may not be accurate.
Uh-huh.
He also found a new form of revenue other than
Now
working
this
for the
I find
railroad.
interesting.
I know, right?
Yes.
The new Indianapolis Southport toll road went right by his property. Now, this is now what is today called Hanna Avenue.
Yes.
And it's down on the south side of what would have been his old
Imagine still having
property.
to pay to go down the road.
Oh,
Yeah,
I know,
yeah.
right?
Oh yeah.
Well, the road would actually be drivable then.
Yeah, no more potholes.
By God, we would
Oh,
not
man.
have anything but perfect roads.
The only
right.
one.
Yeah.
So he collected that toll on that Hanna Avenue for his entire lifetime until he died in 1895.
Wow.
Because that was all of his property.
Oh yeah. That had to be a hefty sum.
Oh, I think over the years, probably.
Yeah,
Yeah. So Alexander married Elizabeth Jackson when he was 51, and she was somewhere around 37, we think. And again, I can't find notation of their wedding banns in the newspaper, of their marriage.
Makes it
Nothing.
kind of interesting why it was that quiet.
I really was surprised I didn't find more about him when I was Googling through newspapers. But they wanted to have a family, but it wasn't to be. Stories say that Elizabeth became pregnant, but suffered either a miscarriage or a stillbirth around March of 1875.
Yeah, and this is really debated too.
It really is. Now, the Encyclopedia of Indianapolis is, it's a book, but it's also an online publication that I found. And it says March 16th of 1875 is when this happened. I can't find records. But then again, there wouldn't have been a notice in the newspaper that Hannah's lost a child. That just wouldn't have happened.
No,
Especially if
and-
he's as private as he seems to
Exactly.
be.
Well,
he
and on
seems
top
to
of
be.
that, they didn't record those children. If the children were still born, I think the rule used to be, and this extends way back, unless the
Right.
child was born live and then passed after, there was no death. And
Right.
even then, a lot of times, there still wasn't a death certificate. They were
Exactly.
just buried on the property,
Exactly.
and nothing else was said about
Right. And during that time, you wouldn't have been broadcasting that you were in the family way anyway. That would
Yeah.
have been a private family matter, family issue. So the people at Encyclopedia of Indianapolis, I don't know if they have access to, family records or journals or something that make this notation.
it. Yeah.
But a lot of the podcasts out there say that proof of this stillbirth is a small
Yeah, the marker.
unmarked grave in the family plot. Now, people say the family plot is on the Hanna estates, and it's
It is
not.
I've seen it. I've been
They
there.
are buried at Crown Hill
Hill.
Cemetery.
Yep.
And there are pictures of their graves on Find a Grave through Ancestry.com.
Yep.
I've not been personally. I'm going to have to go look to see if there's a small
There
unmarked
is. I've been there.
grave.
Yeah.
Okay,
They
so there's a
used to,
small
Crown
unmarked
Hill
stone at
did
Crown
this,
Hill. Okay.
Halloween thing, and they would do this. Been years ago. So, they would walk you through, and I was in college when I went through, and they would take you to different prominent graves.
Yeah.
And they would show you these graves. And there is a marker there, and they point out, they believe that this is a child
Now that's cool.
that was died
Okay.
during death. And, you know, the guy that went with us was really kind of neat. He dresses the party, carries a lantern, a candlelit lantern. It was really cool. I mean, it had a really neat aura about the whole thing. But they take you to all the different famous graves there in Crown Hill, and that's one of them they stop at. And they talk about his accomplishments, and they say, this is his child. So they point it out that way.
Okay.
Now, when I asked him when I got him aside, the guide, I said, you know, is this on record here? He says, beats me. He says, they hire me to do this. This is a script I work off of. And that was the end of that conversation. So I never did find out if it's actually on record with
Right.
Crown Hill. But, you know, I would think, because Crown Hill has very good records going way back since the inception, when it switched out from the General Cemetery over where the soccer stadium being built. Before that, they kept very good records, and they even kept the transfers from that cemetery. So I'm from Green Hill,
Right.
So I'm wondering if it isn't on file there, and I might just
It might be, but
might be
you know,
worthwhile to look at it. You know,
even Googling through Ancestry, you can find Hannah and you can find Alexander. You can find their graves. I didn't find death certificates.
yeah.
And so you would think if there's record through Crown Hill,
Yes.
and their information there is on Ancestry, but maybe somebody just hasn't gone in and pulled all the records and downloaded it into Ancestry yet.
That could be.
You know,
you know,
because there was
most
very
people that
little
do
information
that-
on Ancestry for these people.
Yeah, most of the people that do that are authors or somebody that's really working on it.
Yeah.
And there might have not been a time for them to do that yet.
Yeah, exactly. So that'd be
Because,
interesting.
you know, funny thing is, all the stories that I've read and all the books before we did this broadcast, every one of them pretty much relates to another book, which relates to another book.
Yeah.
It doesn't. None of them say, "Well, I went down to the county records and
Right.
this is what I found." They say,
Right.
"Well, you know, this was in this book," and so you know, I
They
I
just
don't know
rehash the same story
exactly.
over and over.
I don't know anyone's done any of the research or legwork on it.
Right,
You know?
right. So Elizabeth dies in 1888, and she was 53, I think.
Uh-huh.
Alexander died in April of 1895 at 73, and they're buried in Crown Hill, like we've been
Yeah.
talking about. And both of them died in the home, which is not unusual.
Yeah.
And then they were also waked from the home as well, from what I can tell. Again,
That was normal.
yeah, totally normal. But since Hannah had died without any heir to his estate, which was vast, I think they estimated
yeah.
at $40,000 in
350 acres?
1895.
Holy cow.
Yeah, 350 acres.
That's in Marion County.
Right, exactly. And so the estate was dealt with by nephews. And there was actually one article where one nephew was trying to get the other nephew off as executor because he was wasting the funds and not
Nothing
doing what he was
brings
supposed to
out
be doing.
family values.
They're
Nothing
trying
like
to
a
clear this
funeral or a
family together
reunion.
like a death.
Yeah. So all 350 acres were actually subdivided and then sold off. The plot with the house was bought by Roman Ohler, Oehler, in 1899. And he got 21 acres, I think I remember. 21 acres.
Oh, yeah.
And that was the acres with a house on it. So Ohler is a fun character to research. He is thoroughly enjoyable. Indiana is known for its German heritage. We have a
Sure,
lot of
yeah.
German immigrants. The Athenaeum downtown.
Heidelberg Cafe.
Exactly. Oh my God.
We were there during Christmas getting a few things. Edelweiss, yeah.
Oh my gosh. My grandmother immigrated from Belgium right after the war. She was a war bride.
Mm-hmm.
And she lived right around the corner from the German, the Heidelberg Cafe there. And we would go there all the time because she would want to get her European chocolates.
And JJ, if you're listening, that's free advertisement.
There
I want
you
to know
go.
that. Remember
love
that
you.
when I get my next cappuccino over there.
Yeah. So Ohler is a German immigrant. He came over in 1859. He's a Civil War vet, was part of an Indiana battery.
Yeah.
And he became a jeweler and had a jewelry store in downtown Indianapolis.
You know, the funny thing is when you go through the home, I assume it's still there since last time I've been through in 09, they have a grandfather clock that has the Ohler business name on the front of it that he put in.
Oh, neat.
It came from one of his original shops.
Oh, neat.
It's a beautiful piece. It's all
Oh.
done out in glass. It's very nice.
Oh, wonderful. So he and his family had the home from 1899 all the way to almost present, really. So let's get into it here. His daughter and her husband, Marion Elder, lived in the house after Roman died. And then they raised their 4 kids there until the early 60s, when Romina Oler Elder was now widowed. And the children moved her out of the house because she was living there all alone, and they didn't feel that she was well enough to do the upkeep. She was still shoveling coal into a coal furnace for heat for the house.
You know how old she was then?
Let's see. I think she was 80-something when she died in 1979 or 78.
Yeah.
So
probably 60s?
Late 60s, early 70s by the time they took her out in 62, I think. Yeah. But during the time that the Ohlers had the house, the article in 1962 that I read referred to the house as the Hanna Oler Elder House.
Yes.
And like I told you before we started recording, in my opinion, I think it should go back to the Hanna Oler Elder House.
Well, everyone contributed quite a bit to its
history. They did. The
Yeah.
older elders really embraced this house. They were in it the longest.
Yes.
Even to this day, they still own the trust, I believe, for the house. We'll get into that in a little bit because I really don't know after a certain time period, but I think you have more information on that.
Some, yes.
But anytime you Google Roman Oler and newspapers.com, he comes up all over the place. There was one article that says, "Will give entertainment. A pleasant event is planned for the Oler home near the city. It's a benefit for the Fresh Air Mission, which has been arranged. It will be given at the home of Roman Oler on the south side of the city at stop number 4 on the Indianapolis-Columbus Southern Trunction."
Yes.
And he would open his home and his lawn for fundraisers all the time.
Yes.
He was very prominent in the German section of the newspaper, and it's actually all in German, which I couldn't read any of it, but I could see his name pop up all over the place.
Could read his name.
I could read his name. I knew that he was important somewhere. But there's a lot of newspaper activity around it, which reinforces Alexander Hanna and his wife Elizabeth were very private, very reserved, very quiet people. Roman was opposite. He loved to travel. He was a world traveler. He was married twice. Romina is actually the daughter of his second wife. I think he had 3 by the first wife and 3 by the second. But
actually, something that won't show up in the history is he was a brother Mason. I did find that out a little bit. He was a Mason, and he did belong to the shrine. But he didn't belong to...
explains the parties.
Yeah, he wasn't in Murat. He was actually out of Corsair in Chicago.
Oh, okay.
And that's why, which at the time, and I even though I belonged to Murat, I was trying to think, but Murat wasn't around at that point. So
it was the closest.
It was the closest. He belonged to it out of Corsair.
And I'm sure he was part of the Athenaeum without
I guarantee you.
Without a doubt.
I guarantee you he was. That was the big social. There was 2 German clubs. That was one, and the other one was, it's over by the water company, was by the water company. And God, I can't remember it now. Something Stag. And it had been there for years. And those were the 2 prominent ones. If you were German, you belonged to those. Me and former... founder Ed Adams, we were looking at purchasing a bar way back around 2010 or so. We were looking at the over near the Sacred Heart area, and we actually found the Volrath, which is located, the Volrath we actually were about to buy, and in its day, this was one of the legendary locations because that whole area was German. And they would come in and have coffee in the morning, and it was a bar, but it was also kind of a diner, if you will, for the German population. It was a meeting place. And so that was very prominent in Indiana.
Yeah.
But most certainly anybody of his stature would have automatically joined Freemasonry and joined the shrine. These are things he wanted to be a part of.
Yeah,
so.
He was very active.
Yeah.
He even was tooling around in his Studebaker.
Yes.
Just before his death. He was all over the place. He was a really fun guy, from what I can tell in the newspapers. A lot of fun. The Historical Society during the 1960s would hold a lot of open houses there. And again, like I said, it was known as the Hanna Oler Elder House. And I think it was part of their way to get the house into the public, current day public.
Yes.
Because they wanted to get it on the historical register. And the article from 1966 that I told you about stated that the house was open for sale in 1966.
Yes, it was open. I remember reading something about that one of the stories.
Right, and there's discussions with Romina's sons, David and I think Robert. I can't remember. David stuck out because I think David
was kind of the controlling edge of that, I think.
Okay, because I think he was probably one of the most recent owners still,
I got
right?
to meet him when we were there that time when I was young. And I didn't meet him when we did the investigation in 2009. I did meet Paul and talk to Paul because Paul was a member. We'll get to that later. But anyway, so I know he was around at that point and very prominent in its day-to-day operations.
Right. So in this article, this is where you get that Alexander Hanna was the strict Quaker, the postmaster, the sheriff, the circuit court clerk, and all that. And I don't think that was accurate.
I think maybe back then they didn't want to disgrace him or take a chance on getting his retribution. So, when they said, oh, he's a strict Quaker, but they didn't attach him to any church that way. It was kind of the easy out, if you will.
That, or they're confusing him with his father, Sam.
Yeah.
Because Sam seemed to have some of these positions, if not all of them. So I think maybe, oral tradition passed down, they forgot that was actually Samuel, not Alexander, that had done all of those. But the article is really fun because David is then reminiscing with his brother and Romina, who's there during that open house. They're telling the stories of their growing up and the fun things that they did and all of that. And that was a really, really fun article. But that article...
what was the date on that article?
That is November 13th, 1966 from the Indianapolis Star. Hanna House has held several families in style, and it's got really cool pictures from the inside, and it actually shows
that went.
There's actually, that's possibly the grandfather clock you were talking about.
Oh, probably so.
Probably so.
Yes.
Yeah. So that was fun. So shortly after that, in the 1966, I think in the article, David's talking about how he and the family are just so sad that none of their family is ever going to live in the house again, and it's hard for them to think about selling it. So they didn't sell it. They rented it out to John and Gladys O'Brien. And I got to flip my page here. So they rented the home, and they set up an antique or used furniture store.
Yes.
In the main part of the house, and then they lived in the back portion of the house. And so you're like, back portion, main portion. So for those of us
it gets very confusing
who
if you
don't
haven't been there to see
know
it. Yeah.
what it looks like, let's go ahead and break the house down just a little bit.
Okay.
And it's been years since I've been there, and I was only there twice.
Okay, I can help you on something.
One time, I don't remember.
I can't help you at all.
Because it was dark and I was drugged to the haunted house, which I don't do haunted houses. And then the next time, my sister and I went for a historical paranormal evening kind of thing.
I don't want to interrupt. I got to tell you this quick story because I had a guy that ran the haunted manors, and he did this for years next to my lodge. And Tom's his name. And Tom, if you're listening, it was always a great story. And Tom always wanted me to go through his haunted house. He was so proud of all the work he did. And he always you go through. And I said, well, Tom, I'll tell you what. I said, I'll go through yours if you go through one of mine. And he looks at me and goes, no. And he flat out never asked me again because he was so scared. I said, it's not so bad. He goes, no, it's bad enough. I won't go. He says, here, I know it's not real. He says, there, he says,
we're not
it's
sure.
a whole different ball game. I'm sorry. I had to tell that. Yeah.
That's funny. That's great. No, I don't like haunted houses.
I don't care for them.
No,
Well, as a
that
kid,
fear
my
of somebody
dad,
jumping out and touching me freaks me out. But I'll walk through a dark
I got in trouble twice at the
paranormal
Children's
investigation.
Museum, haunted house.
I don't
Once
care if
I,
a ghost touched me, but
Right.
a person touched
I think I must have been about 12, and I had a ghost walk up. And I pulled its hood off, and I had a witch. I jerked its nose off. I was like 6. I didn't really 6, 8. And then later on, I went in junior high, and there was a
Is this
bridge.
where you punched them?
Yeah, it was accidental. No, actually, that was Brookside. But yeah, we were down, and somebody would reach up and grab your feet. And I was with 2 other guys.
no.
When someone grabbed my foot, I just started stomping the hell out of them. And, back then, it was a little looser in what they could do. No, that was on Brookside. And we were at Brookside Haunted House, and I was in my high school years, and some guy came out with a chainsaw. And I got to bear in mind, this is a time when we're talking about Leatherface, and you
Oh,
know.
yeah,
So
yeah.
it had the bar but no chain. But I grew up around chainsaws. I worked at a golf course that was a wood yard in the wintertime. So this son of a gun thought we were really cute to pop out with a McCullough chainsaw and reach up and tap my leg. And when he did, I tapped him slightly to the left jaw and put him out cold on the floor. And that was when all the whistles started, because they didn't have police officers, they had police explorers, and all they gave them was whistles. About that time, the whistles meant to me, time to go. And we all exited out a side emergency door and left in the middle of the haunted house.
Oh,
But I did.
boy.
I decked this poor guy. He ended up in if you look in the star, it's there where, you know, this one, cast member was assaulted. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
If you're looking for who did it,
yeah.
Now we have found out.
Now we found,
Now you
thank
know.
God the 7 years of it's over with. Yeah, can't get me now. Yeah. What the Babyface Nelson says on, you can't get me now, copper. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So the house location, Madison Avenue, for those who are familiar with Indianapolis, runs along the west side of the home and what is today considered the front side of the house.
Yes.
And then many photos of the house are from this angle just to the southwest side. So you kind of get that perspection of it. However, the large porch is on the front of the house has
Yes.
not always been there. It was added on in 1910 by Mr. Oler.
Ah.
And I actually found the building permit in the newspaper.
I thought that was really cool.
Yeah.
I was reading your notes. I thought, holy shit, I didn't know this. Yes.
Yeah, I found the building permit where he had requested to make the addition.
Mm-hmm.
So it's red brick, Italianate architectural style with Greek revival as well. It's 2.5 stories tall in the front because there's an attic portion. It's kind of like a half
Yes.
story in the front. And then there is 2 stories on the back half.
Mm-hmm.
And it's got tall, narrow windows. There's green shutters. These windows used to open up onto a second floor open air type
Yeah, walkway.
porch
Yeah.
area. Not that I would ever walk out on that, but when Mr. Hanna lived, there was a north side of the house that would have been kind of the front entrance.
Yes.
That would have been the main. And there's sort of like a Greek revival square portico over that entrance. And that would have been the main entrance in and out.
Yes.
Then there is, once he got married, there is a second half built onto the back.
Yes.
Okay, and so when you kind of
That's
looking,
the summer kitchen and the
the summer
servant
kitchen, the
quarters and-
smokehouse,
yeah, and the
the
dairy.
root cellar, all of that, and that was added on after Elizabeth came.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the really cool thing that I think when I was there and it was night and dark, I wasn't creeped out on the inside of the
Yeah.
house. I was creeped out on the outside of the house.
Well, it does look a little ominous.
It is ominous, especially if you come down to that south side and you're looking at the house from the south side. You can see the front part of the structure, which was the
Yes.
original.
Well, back in the 70s, they put candles, lit the electric candles in the
Oh,
window.
really?
And it was creepy. It was
Oh,
creepy.
man.
Yeah.
But then there's like a little dog run, walkway
On the second level?
section. No, from connecting the first half
Yeah,
to,
yeah, yes,
to the
yes, there's-
smokehouse,
yes,
the
yes.
servants' quarters.
Yes.
And there's a little courtyard area, and there's
Yes.
wire balconies.
You
It
used to have
reminds
a
you of
pond
being
in there.
Okay. It
Yes.
reminds you of being in a courtyard of the French Quarter.
Yes. Well, the whole thing was
whole
designed with that in mind. It was designed just like being in Louisiana.
Yeah, it's really kind of spooky, and it was dark out, and there's trees and everything, It was really dark, but that's probably that was the spookiest part for me, was
Yeah.
to be outside in that little courtyard area. That was creepy to me. Okay, so the second half again was added when Elizabeth and Alexander got married. Now that was not open to me when I was there. That's where the caretakers were living, and so that's why I think probably when the O'Briens
No
had
one has got in there but once.
they lived
Yeah.
back there, and then the main
Yeah.
house was always,
Yeah.
for
And it was the way that worked was the lower half was the summer kitchen, and then actually the dairy and the smokehouse were set off separate. They weren't actually part of that complex.
okay.
A lot of people don't
They're
know
separate
that.
outbuildings.
They were separate outbuildings.
Okay, so those might be the outbuildings
Yeah.
that Roman
exactly
had built.
and it had a kind of like a pond. I mean, it wasn't an official pond. They weren't fish in it, but it had a little courtyard area where we walk around. Then in the second story, above the walkway going over to there was this way that went to the apartment.
Okay.
When I was there in the 70s, there was a renter that was there. He worked nights, and because I actually talked to, well, and I'll get to that in a few minutes, but anyway, as I was talking to someone, they said, yeah, he works nights, so he doesn't hear anything that goes on. And he was there during the day. Now, when we were there in 2009 doing an investigation, there was a renter there. And the apartment, it's like a small 2-bedroom apartment up there. And I've got to see the inside of it one time briefly. And the gentleman that was living there at the time in 2009 allowed us to come into there and look at it. Just me, and I think it was Ed and Jim Hampton. We got to go in there to look real quick and come back out.
Okay.
And that was it. But the lower half is the summer kitchen, and it actually goes out. There's actually a spring on the property.
Oh, cool.
And it was what they used for the dairy, which was common. And dairy, we didn't have refrigerators back then. When I say we, I didn't live back then. So I want to tell I wasn't part of that.
Just putting that out there.
Just
He's not that old.
there. Yeah, not that old.
What are you hiding?
Yeah, that's right. I'll never forget my poor dad, when he died in 2016, he looked at me one day and says, "You remember when they rationed stuff in World War II?" I go, "No, Dad, I don't." Yeah.
No.
Poor guy had dementia, but he didn't realize. I'm thinking, hell no, I wasn't alive during that. I don't remember any of that. But anyway, yeah, they use this cold water to keep the milk from curdling and going bad. And so they put all their dairy products out there. And it was not unusual to have a spring house on any location.
No, exactly.
Had a trough, the water ran around it, and that's how they cooled it.
Yeah.
Before the days of refrigerators and the Iceman, which we're not going to talk about that either. But anyway, the long story short, it had a lot on the property, including they had built at one point a single garage, which was where the smokehouse used to be. And then they built a 2-story iffy kind of garage. It had storage above it that you could walk up, and two garage bays. And I'll talk about that later, but that was built on the property.
Yeah.
That was after all this.
Right, okay. So finally in 1978, they succeeded, and the Hanna House, as it's now known again, is listed on the Historical Places Registry.
Yes.
And then in the 1980s is when the haunted house attraction started. However, the O'Briens and their customers were already claiming encounters at the Hanna House in the 70s.
Oh, yes.
In the 70s. Yes. So I know I'm going to get real quick into the original story of the Hanna House, which my own personal opinion, I dispute a little bit.
Sure.
And I'll explain why.
And please tell us.
Yeah,
that's fine.
So stories start with Alexander and his involvement with the Underground Railroad.
Yes.
He was a station master. Now, some people say he was a conductor, which is inaccurate because conductors are the ones that traveled with the slaves along the tracks. And station masters were the homeowners where they stopped.
Yes.
So he was obviously the homeowner on the stop of the tracks. He was on a large tract of land, no doubt about it, right?
Which
250 to 350 acres. It is wooded, and it would have provided good coverage. So the story is that one night there was a group of slaves hiding in his cellar when a fire started. Mm-hmm. And because of the secrecy, they couldn't bury them,
Yeah.
Well, publicly,
they couldn't bury
not
them.
in sight, not on the property. It would have drawn way too much.
Exactly.
One person sees it and it goes out, and they could be in a lot of trouble.
Right. So the slaves who were unable to get out perished, and so they had to be buried under the floor of the cellar. Yeah. So there are also rumors that there was a collapsed tunnel found underground, seeming to be leading toward the Hanna House, which, in my opinion, could be either here nor there. I mean, the Underground Railroad did not use tunnels, so possibly they use tunnels to hide in, but not to travel through.
No. Well, and no, go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's okay. No. It's okay. And like we said earlier, he didn't have a lot going on in the house. They didn't hold parties there. It was not a attraction
would lead
place.
To why maybe
maybe he wanted to keep his property secret for this, so that he didn't have people traipsing all over the place, investigating.
Well, back then, General Assembly wasn't a situation where you had to worry about stalkers or somebody trying to, draw a hammer on you, and it wasn't that kind of thing.
No. I mean,
but still,
and he was a quiet man.
Yes.
And he was buying up huge tracts of land. However, my problem with this situation is his house was not built until 1858.
Yes.
Towards the end of the Underground Railroad movement. Yeah. I mean, that was going through 65, 66. So it could have been. It was up and it was there. But it wasn't as prevalent of a need at that point.
No, by then it's winding down. That's toward the end. Yeah.
And, of course, he didn't marry Elizabeth until the 1870s. So obviously
Yes.
Elizabeth was not part of this because, it wouldn't have been used at that point. And a lot of his land buildup was, in the 70s and 80s.
Yes.
1870s, 1880s.
Yeah.
So is it possible? Maybe. But I don't think so.
Well,
I don't think so.
and why do you
I just
disagree?
think he was a quiet man. He
Yeah.
wasn't a prominent man. He was just living his life, being on the farm.
Sure.
I don't think he was
Yeah.
involved in the General Assembly. That was his dad. That was his dad's thing. I
Okay.
think he was just a quiet home guy who wanted to farm his land and be quiet and not have anybody bother him.
Well, and the funny thing is, I want to take us kind of sideways just for a minute because there is no records of this.
No, well, no.
And I haven't pulled. Now I'll be honest, I haven't, and I know you haven't either. Haven't pulled General Assembly records or went back.
I haven't.
We could contact the Marion County or the
We could.
state of Indiana. I mean, and
But
certainly
his
we could look at
obituary
it, but-
doesn't mention it.
Yeah, and that was something that would have
That's-
been very well. I mean, if you look, and I'll tell you what, being a Freemason, I can tell you these guys have egos that
Right.
One of the big things, and I'm going to quote a gentleman that I have trouble quoting at times, but Carson Smith once said that, he was on tour, and I'll never forget this. And one of the ladies, he looks at her, and she was asking a lot of questions. He said, and this was tour at the Scottish Rite. He said, ma'am, do you know why all the buildings in Freemasonry are so large and glorious and grandiose? And she says, no, why? He says, it's to house the egos of the men that are in it. and so, I mean, I'll be honest with you. You look at
I
anybody
bet she
that...
stopped asking questions after that.
I suspect so. I was not on the tour, but I had this related to me. Now, I'll be honest with you. I think that a lot of the long run of things, that, when you look at a Freemason that has passed away, he'll have this big lineage of all the things he belonged to. Even if he isn't a Freemason, if he's a member of Knights of Columbus, and that was common. To have 3 lines for such a prominent individual in no obit is really unusual.
Yeah, and half of his, what I'll call his obit, was really just an article about his death. It wasn't his obituary. Discussed all of the accomplishments his father had.
Sure.
So if they're
But again,
listing his father's accomplishments, they should have listed his accomplishments.
Exactly.
And they only talked about his time in California, his building up the acres,
and my
working for the
understanding,
railroad.
from what I've read, is the time in California when he owned the ranch out there, the vegetable ranch. He lived here during that period of time and ran it. I've heard several conflicting saying that he had an investment in it, but it wasn't solely his.
Yeah, and I heard both. I could see
Both ways, yeah.
They were both. And then there was an article that didn't even mention the ranch at all.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Sure.
who knows? It could have been.
Well, and I think that, one thing I want to discuss for a minute, because this is a question I thought of. Something popped in my mind, and I heard other people say this: why did we have underground railroads in Indiana? Because we were a northern state that didn't approve of slavery. Well, not exactly.
Not exactly.
If you're a student of history, first of all, before the Civil War, when was the Civil War?
1960, 1965.
No, 18.
18.
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
Woo!
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, you had the other end of it right. I knew where you were going. Yeah. So
Well, I put in my notes at the turn of the century, and then wait.
Yeah.
At the turn of the 20th century. So,
yeah, it gets confusing.
because we're in
I
the
tell you.
21st century now.
Well, that's always caught me. I never understood why the 21st. Yeah.
The kids nowadays say that we're from the 1900s.
Yeah.
I know,
Yeah,
and I'm
yeah,
like,
yeah.
oh gosh.
Yeah, when they say that, I look at them and go,
So back
yeah,
in the 1900s,
Yeah.
Elvis Presley. I'm like,
That's why I'm going to buy a
gosh.
cane as soon as I can. It makes a good weapon to smack somebody with. But anyway,
Yeah.
at my advancing years. But anyway, I'll be honest with you. When I looked at that, that's some of the interest that I had because I couldn't figure out why. Well,
Right.
it turns out that this was a big thing. At that point in time, it was a big thing, in Indiana. If you had slaves on your property, the runaways, you could be jailed for that.
You could be.
Yeah, you could be prosecuted and jailed
Yeah.
for that because it was illegal to house runaway slaves. Even though we didn't prove as slavery in Indiana, it still was illegal because that was private property.
Yeah,
owned
just
by
like
somebody
many
from another
northern
state.
states. Yeah,
Sure.
you couldn't harbor
And there
escaped
was,
slaves. Yeah,
And having
A
been
lot of states were like that.
yeah.
Oh yeah, and one time I was an asset recovery agent for a while. In other words, bail enforcement or bounty hunter, and we had a lot more power than a lot of people realized. We could go into residence, police couldn't without a warrant if we thought they were holding our felon that we were collecting the warrant on. it always came with a cost. If you broke down a door and he wasn't there, you'd be buying a new door.
Yeah.
And, but the thing is, in that period of time, they could come onto your property and effectively want to search your residence. And
Right.
I've never seen the movie Django, but I understand that it has a lot of that in there where this
Yeah.
guy's traveling as a bounty hunter, picking up his bounties. He has
Yeah.
the right to enter certain areas to find them. And, I'll tell you that the one thing I can say is that slavery may have been outlawed in Indiana, tongue in cheek, but there was a lot of legislation. In 1807, they passed or 1805, I'm sorry, the Indiana Territory House of Representatives passed a new law that was called the contract holder. And so if someone came up from Georgia, Alabama, and they had contract that showed they owned
Right.
that slave,
Yes.
you could get charged for housing them, and they had a
Yes.
right to get them and take them back there to Alabama.
Right.
So
Right.
that's why it was required. And where the slaves were going was Canada.
Right.
And I would like to point out that, since I don't have any affiliation to Canada, sorry, Leah. Anyway, but yeah, they do
Sorry,
house draft
Canada.
dodgers and slaves. So anyway, illegal slaves. But Mia's from Canada. That's one of our ladies who runs social
They
media.
should have
Sorry,
gone
Leah.
to Mexico.
Yeah, anyway, yeah, Mexico never kept records. Yeah, we don't have stinking badges. Anyway, but yeah, having said all that,
Yeah.
it's interesting because I never realized that's what they were doing.
Right. And we do know, and I told you before we were
Yeah.
recording, that we do have stops on the Underground Railroad in Indiana because
Yes.
I lived across the street from a documented historical site that we know was part of the
Yes.
Underground Railroad. So if we can't find documentation at this point that Hannah's property was part of the Underground Railroad, then that causes me to question. Not that it
Yeah.
wasn't, but knowing that there are documentation that we can follow to prove that a site
Yes.
was, and we can't find documentation on this.
I'm going to go with a Vegas odds of 50-50 because...
It could be
Yeah.
absolutely 50-50.
Yeah. Well,
you
the
know.
only reason I say that is
But the other thing is, if there was a fire, and
Yes.
if the people did perish in that fire, he was on a working farm in wooded areas.
Yes.
He could dig anything he wanted anywhere
Sure.
without being questioned. I don't think that they were buried in the cellar.
Well,
If it happened, that would not be the place
Yeah.
I would want to bury a dead body.
350 acres.
You've got plenty of other land
Yeah.
to secretly bury them.
Well, and I don't think anybody was watching,
No,
the fear
he
of
was
a lot
too
of
quiet of a
people
man.
have today.
He
Yeah.
kept to himself.
Yes. Yeah, the thing that gets me...
Cow died.
Yeah, cow died.
Cow
yeah,
died,
yeah.
right?
Well,
Exactly.
And for all my prepper fans out there that I've associated with, taught classes for years, one of the things they always say is bury a dead cow or dead dog before you bury a body, because you put the body at 10 foot and you put the cow or something at 6 foot. That way when the cadaver dog finds it, they don't pay attention to it.
Oh, good thing we're not a true crime podcast.
Yeah. You hint to all the preppers out there. That's a hint from Ghost to Ghost.
Oh, Lord.
We are now. Just in case you need to know, yeah.
Let's read
How
our
to dispose
bylines
of a
here.
body
We covered.
in 101, yeah. Yes. And I'm sure that if we had a lawyer right now, he'd be all over
He'd
the
be
damn place
all
going,
over it.
cut that, edit it. Anyway,
Your phone's off, right?
yeah, that's right. Yeah, I'm sure somewhere. That's why we can't keep lawyers.
Gary's calling.
Oh, Lord.
Yeah. And Gary's calling, going, no. Phil Thresher, which is attorney for the Shrine, two of the famous things I always remember him telling me is, he says, remember these phrases, because we got in a little trouble about an email one time, and he looked at me and he says, understand this. He says, by advice of counsel, I was not present during this event. I was in Oklahoma. Deny. He says, you go far. He says, never put anything in an email you don't want on the front page of the Indianapolis Star. Thank you, brother Phil Thresher. And so that's always been my working attribute. But anyway,
Right. So,
getting back to this, though.
even if the slaves'
he's got a
story
ton of
is not
land.
true,
Yeah.
there is still a lot of history in this house.
Well, sure.
I mean, Elizabeth and
Before we get
Alexander
off the
lived in
slave
this
thing,
house.
I want to cover a couple things, because
Yeah.
there's a couple different versions of this story that I
Yes.
heard over the years as kids. One is that there was a secret room in the cellar.
Right.
And for a long time, it was said it was behind the preserve shelf. And when you go downstairs in the cellar, there's a large wall that has none but preserves. And these are very old preserves, and they keep them more for display. No, I don't think they would eat them for any reason. But anyway, supposedly behind those walls is behind that wall is where this hidden room was at. They kept the slaves in. Now, the thing is, in an old house like that, yes, it's very solid, it's very hard to hear things. But even if you're on the second floor, if there's a fire, you're going to know it. The problem is when you walk through the basement, and I've been through that basement on at least 4 occasions, okay? there is no sign of a fire in any of the rafters or any of that. And somebody says, well, they probably replaced them. Do you know how hard it is to replace a supporting member on a having
precisely.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Owning
precisely.
a general contracting company, I can tell you, it's almost impossible to pull one of those out. You sister them. If one's bad, you go back and cut it out to where it's good, and you sister several, one or at least one, if not two, depending on code, to hold that floor. But you don't replace them. There's no sign of a fire there. So I'm kind of halfway wondering if this is a true story, if they had a spare room somewhere that has been walled up. Now, if you look around the jars and stuff of this wall, you'll see where there's cracks, which are probably settling. But you can also see where there's newer and older mortar, where it looks like it could be something that was walled up.
Mm-hmm. It could have been a root cellar.
And that was it, because they actually had
there was the root cellar on the other side. Exactly.
So it's always kind of wondered if that wasn't the room the slaves died in. Now, I agree. If you're going to bury them, now the only catch to this was, the reason I say it might have been in the basement, that might have been what their thinking was. If you have hired hands, if you're running 350 acres, you have hired hands.
That's true. Yeah.
And you don't want those
too
hired
many
hands
eyes.
that know, because those guys are already in bed, and you don't want them to know.
True.
And if you are owning slaves, then the sometimes...
Where did they come from?
Well, exactly. And 50% of your servants back then were probably black. That even if they weren't slaves, they were black and freed, but they would work in that area. Or were slaves that you gave them their freedom. A lot of people gave them their freedom, and they never left. We investigated a home about 4 or 5 years ago that had slave quarters in the basement. It was out near Martinsville. And what happened was when the slaves were given their freedom, they chose to stay on as family. And they became family later on, but they stayed on as servants. So, it's very easy to say that may have been why they done it. I mean, it's a plausible. I'm not...
It is totally plausible.
I'm not throwing my hat in one way or another saying it did happen or didn't happen. What I'm saying is, the problem is, I think if you're in a business where you own a house like this, and we see this with the asylum in Louisville, we see this with Waverly, Whispers, all you got to make money off of it. You can't restore it, you can't maintain it, you can't pay the utilities. Yeah,
you got to find some way. So attaching this kind of story and this kind of history would help promote
it's already there,
the house.
So if you prove it to be wrong, that's going to hurt.
But the time
Leave
framing,
it alone, let it ride.
The time framing for me it doesn't fit.
No.
He had just came back to Indiana from California, just built the house. Mm-hmm. He really isn't established enough, I think, to have that kind of freedom and independence.
Yes.
To be able to do that. If he was older and wealthier and if the house had been established longer, I think that it's more likely that it would have happened.
Yeah, and I mean, either way, I there's several books, and we will talk about them when we claim our sources, but one was More Haunted Houses, and this is a book I grew up with, Haunted Houses and More Haunted Houses. It was produced by Richard Weiner and Nancy Osborne Ishmael, and that's the two that wrote it. And I've had that book since probably the 70s or 80s. It was I think it was published in 79, so I bought it in the 80s, but I've read it many times over, and it's a 2-book series, but it has that in there and talks about the hidden room. And I remember I talked to one of the individuals, I think it was David, when we were there, and said, "Hey, why don't you drill a hole and see what's in there, and send maybe a camera or something." No, there was no interest in that. And again, that goes back to, hey, if you got a good thing, why? Yeah,
right.
Why would you?
Exactly. You want to preserve the house and have the upkeep.
Yep. So it makes a big difference.
Yeah, but I mean, most of the claims and accounts that we're going to talk about are in the main house itself.
Yes.
And it's of a gentleman in a suit.
Yes.
And a woman in either a black dress or sometimes a peach-colored dress has been seen.
I've heard gray, too.
Yeah. And, of course, there's the smell of decay, which I think the house is known for. What, the smell of death? Is that the name of it?
It's called the house that reeks of death.
The house that reeks of death.
One chapter in one of the books. Yeah,
it's an old house. Of course, it's going to have that decaying, sort of musty, mothball-y smell.
Yeah. And didn't she have roses in every room?
Yeah, so roses and lavender have been claimed as well.
And when roses die, they kind of smell like death.
Yeah, they do. But I don't think that decaying, rotting smell has to be from a decaying body in the floor. I think it's just decay. I mean, the floor is a dirt floor. It's earthy. It's
if it gets moist.
Well, and I heard a legend. Again, this is not something I can prove, that there was a cistern that was covered, because the basement was always dirt to a certain point, and part of it was actually cemented. And a lot of people don't realize this. They actually poured cement and covered it in. There was rumor that there was a cistern underneath there. Part of the reason why they did the cement was to cover the cistern, that no one would ever get into it by accident.
Okay.
There was more of a liability issue, not a, hey, we're hiding something. It's more of a liability. That can bring up a lot of smells and can burp it through the soil.
Exactly.
Especially if they didn't drain it or if it still
Exactly.
gets water in
No
it.
one knows how
And
that
so
was done.
the phantom smells, it's a good story, but to me it isn't
Exactly.
proof. It isn't
and it's
proof.
an old house. It's
Yeah. So let's move on to some of the
smells.
claims and your history, because
Okay.
I wasn't with the group when you guys did.
No, and a couple of things I want to point out. A lot of people don't realize in the main parlor there's this wonderful, wonderful fireplace. It has 2 cast iron.
Lots of fireplaces almost.
Oh yeah, it's about every room.
Yeah.
And it has 2 cast iron effigies in the center. There's a picture, a relief in cast iron of Diana, and that's what they call it, the relief of Diana. And people don't realize it, but during 1865, Abraham Lincoln stood at that hearth, at that fireplace, and practiced his speeches that he was giving in Indiana for his election. And he stayed there several times. That's not in the general history.
No, it's
You'll
not.
find that out in oral history, and that was something that I actually located inadvertently while I was looking through some of my notes, and that was something that Dave Elder had gave us the time we were there.
Well, it was a very big farm just south of Indianapolis as he was coming through, and
Lots of room.
Samuel Hanna was probably well known in the General Assembly. So, hey, you can stay with my son. He's a quiet guy. Nobody ever goes out there.
Exactly.
Plenty of room for you and your guards.
Well, a lot of people don't realize Lincoln. Yeah, Lincoln was the first one to have Secret Service in the guards. Now, it wasn't called Secret Service.
Pinkerton.
They hired the Pinks. And the Pinks, that's where a lot of people don't realize, but that was where the birth of the brass knuckles came around. And brass knuckles actually were designed by a lady, the first Lady Pink.
Yep.
And she realized she didn't have the striking power of these guys, so she designed these knuckles. And when she gave the demonstration, she put this poor SOB on the ground. She hit him in the stomach, broke 2 ribs during a demonstration, dropped him nut and flat. And when she pulled her glove off, she had this brass knuckle set. And that's all the Pinkertons were issued brass knuckles, and that's where it came from. It was originally designed as a protection detail, and it was developed during that period of time with Abraham Lincoln.
Oh, cool.
So, it was kind of interesting that, that gave him the availability with that big farm.
That's interesting. Yeah, I didn't pull that up in my research.
And also, the O'Briens are linked to a German housekeeper. If you didn't know that, there was a German housekeeper who was extremely, extremely strict and we'll say overbearing. And she worked for the elders, and that's how some of the O'Briens came into it. And actually, Gladys O'Brien was distantly related to this German housekeeper.
Oh.
There was actually two. A German lady was a cook.
Okay.
And there was another housekeeper in there, and they both were related. That's how they're kind of tied in.
Okay.
Back in... I'm going to start there. Back in the 70s, my dad took me over there, and I was always interested in ghosts, and I was always pursuing this thing. And Dad loaded me up when we went to the Hanna House, and they were still not on the registry at that time. They were open for historical tours, and I got a really rare opportunity because I got in there, and I was all about ghosts. And my dad had been talking to a gentleman who I believe was Dave Elder. I don't recall who it was for sure, because you remember I'm right about 11 or 12 right then. But Dave Elder was the guy kind of standing there, and he said, I remember him asking me, he says, "Are you really interested in real ghosts?" I said, "Yes, I really am." He says, "Well, that lady over there," and he pointed at this little lady. She was very small and petite and very fragile, sitting in a chair, dressed in kind of black and gray. He says, "That's the lady you want to talk to." Well, at the time, I had no idea. This is Romania. Is it Romania? Romania Elder, who had married in the family, and this is who's sitting there. And I went over, and I think she indulged me because I was young and I was a child. She told me a few things, and sitting next to her, I would later find out was Gladys O'Brien,
oh, cool.
and who had owned the antique store. And she told me about different things. So I got to hear one-on accounts. Of course, I was 12. I wasn't taking notes. I wasn't documenting.
Right.
But, I got to hear this, and this lady was very nice to me. And she told me about the bedroom and about some psychics and people that came through that thought they saw things. And she told me about the many, and we were talking about this registry of appearances. And,
yes.
And, several of those, she talked to me about the man in mutton chops at the top of the stairs, and told me about, Dad, which was one of the ghosts that one of their children were speaking to. Mrs. O'Brien told me that. But I got this wonderful opportunity to meet these people in real life, and I had no idea how impacting this would be later in life.
Yeah.
In 2009, we were contacted, and a gentleman who owned it, I think still owns it to this day, although we don't know. I tried to contact him before this broadcast, and I had a late start. I didn't get it started soon enough, which I should have. And Paul Gardner is his name. And at one time, I believe Dave Elder and Paul Gardner were joint owners of this residence. Although I was told as of last that Paul Gardner was one of the owners. He was one of the owners in '09. I know him because he's a fellow Mason. He's a member of Southport Lodge. And there's a question of whether or not he may have passed or not. We don't know. So at this time, I'm still researching just for nothing else, for record, or, and I do believe at some point that, we're going to find out, he was at least owner for at least 20 years. But when we went in '09, they had a foundation they'd set up trying to support the house. A lot of it had been redone. Matter of fact, I remember, and I just listened this morning to one of our Dead Mike broadcasts, and one of the ladies there that was reading us through with Dave Elder had said how much Paul had done and repaired and fixed. And so I talked to one of the gentlemen who is a good friend with him, and he didn't know anything about his death at that point, but it doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Right.
Post-COVID nowadays, a lot of times we don't get that information on time. But anyway, when we went in, there was a lot. I got to paraphrase this because at the time this was more of a PR event than an investigation. We had been invited by D. Millay to do a PR, do a little program for them to explain to them about parapsychology, because a lot of D. Millay were very interested. To my surprise, I arrived at the lodge early to find D. Millay and D. Millay from Speedway and D. Millay from several other locations. There's like 60 guys here. And then we had 2 or 3 Job's Daughters Bethels that were there. So I thought it was going to be 6 guys. I end up showing up and there's like 60 people there.
Wow.
And I'm going, where did all these people come from? They said, well, we opened it up and let everybody come in. What the heck? And so...
What the heck?
Yeah, what the heck? And so... we explained to them, we do this PowerPoint, and they go, and what they did was they were all volunteers at that time at the Hanna House. Because, and when we talk about your history, once the O'Briens came in, that's when the elders first got it. They opened an antique store. After they were done with the antique store and it closed, they opened up to the JCs in the 80s, and the JCs ran a haunted house through there.
Right.
Well, when the JCs were finished, there were several people that wanted to try to go at it, and it was pretty failed. The prospect D. Millay stepped in and said, we'll run the haunted house, because they had done work at the time for Haunted Manor, which was next door to the lodge at that time. Mm-hmm. So they stepped in to take care of this. So this is when was my connection, how I met Paul Gardner. And so anyway, and they said, we need you to come down. We'd like you to do an investigation where the boys could go along. Well, again, the boys ended up being about 80 people.
Jeez.
And it was a mess. And so, now bear in mind, we told them, we said, look, we can't do an investigation with 80 people.
Right.
It's not going to work.
No.
There's way too much contamination. We were thinking 1 or 2 boys with each group, and we'd work through the night until we get all 5 through. We're now talking 80 people. And I told them, I said, I don't mind giving up the investigation, because whatever we get, we can't use because there's too much contamination outside. They had everybody outside, and this was really noisy. And I actually wanted the audios, and I'll try to remember to put a clip in at the end. But at the audios, you can hear all the noise and everything while we're trying to set up. There was 80 people there. During the middle of this mess, they're out in the courtyard, this courtyard between the span between the house.
Yeah, that's why I was standing outside in the dark, because we had split our group up. Yeah.
Exactly, and there's this whole courtyard full of young boys and ladies and their adult overseers from Dimaway and Job's. And they're all talking and yelling and carrying on. And you can hear that in the house really well. So we move into there, we decide, okay, we're just going to do this for PR because there's no way we can do a serious investigation. We went and set up equipment just the same, and we tried to divide 5 kids per group. And we figured this out, that we get them all through by 2 in the morning. The good thing is a lot of them weren't allowed to stay. So the ones that weren't allowed to stay past midnight, we tried to rush through first. And we went through some real basic stuff. I mean, we were talking 20-minute turns, which we never do in groups. But anyway, what really complicated things, during this hour, about 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock we started. By 10 o'clock, thunderstorms come in. I mean, thunderstorms.
Wow.
I mean, these are lightning and thunder and a mess. And so we got everybody under the overhang of the walkover, and they're coming in. We had to get them in the house because they're out in pouring rain, and it begins to hail. And there's tornado warnings out. So now watch went right to warnings, and so we got all this mess going on, and we're trying to deal with it. and we got people trying to keep the kids from tracking mud into the houses, and it's totally out of control at this point. So finally the rain quits. We get a handle on it. We shove everybody back out in the wet environment and say, you just have to live here until we get back to get you. Parents were down at the far end. We did find out, and my co-founder found out the hard way, the garage had a second story. The second story loft turned out had a mother raccoon and its babies. Now, one thing I found out in this is, in the words of Steve Irwin, all I had to do is run faster than Ed.
Yeah.
And, because she got very irate when she found out we were coming up to investigate. And she didn't want that area investigated. And so I remember that distinctly. That was one thing that happened. But, there was 2 bedrooms. Of course, Sarah's bedroom and then what they call Grandma's bedroom. That was the 2 areas most known for activity. So we posted cameras there. There was one down by the fireplace. We posted cameras on the main floor. And then you had the basement. Well, the basement had been walled off with these kind of tarps that they used to make a tunnel system when the JCs were doing the haunted house.
Right.
Well, then when that was the same system used. And what they did was they brought you in the front door. You'd walk to the right of the staircase. You'd walk down. There was a bathroom there, and the next door went down to the basement. And then after you got out through the end of the basement, they took you out through a cellar door, one of the flat doors that open up. You went back outside, and and then you went out. That was it. So that's how the haunted house worked. What was still done up as a haunted house. They just recently had several groups in, and they had this seance going on. So in the other section, they had these table and chairs all around where they'd done a seance. And when we came in, it was very hard to do anything in the basement anyway. And every, once we told the story, we'd always tell the story before we took them down. Then we took them down. We just started splitting stuff up. Ed did the basement, I did the attic. And the attic was kind of a problem because they had several windows broken. Now, when you went in the attic, it was beautiful. This house, that would have been another 4 rooms easy in the attic.
Yeah.
When you went in the attic, you went over to the edge, and it had small diagonal windows close to the floor. They're about 2 foot off the floor. Well, half of those were broke open. So you're in the rain, the cars going up and down, Hannah, with the rain going on and the splashing of water. And, you couldn't hear. There was no way you could get an EVP if you wanted to. Now, we did have 2 EVPs we salvaged, but one of them you can't hear. You can't tell if it's one of the kids or not. But I kept that because it showed the chaos that was going on at the time. We got out of there at like 5 a.m. because I remember going down to another brother that owned Pepe's Grill. And we all ended up at Pepe's Grill that night eating at 5 a.m. because, wasn't much more we could do. We did everything we could. The kids thought it was great. And so afterwards, we showed them what little we picked up. We did get a couple of interesting shots. We had a camera that was running in the Sarah's bedroom, and all of a sudden it blacks out, and it's got some very interesting gray, photos like something walked in front of it. Now, we never could prove that, but that was what we ended up with. The problem we ran in with I think with it was the amount of people, the night. Yeah. It was horrible weather, and I think all that combined to be a bad situation. Yeah. And that was the last time we were there, was in 2009.
It'd be nice to get back in again.
It would, and if Paul, and I really hope to hell he's alive. If I get a hold of him, I'll make some arrangements and see what we can do about maybe going back in and investigating.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
Try to get back into that area. But that was several things I wanted to bring up about the time we were in there. So, but I got to meet, Paul at the time, Paul Gardner. I think Dave Elder was still alive then. But at that point, he may still be today. I don't know. I don't have a clue on any of this. So, But those are kind of the ideals. Now, the funny thing about Hannah's written too in all kinds of books, and several things we'll cite. Of course, we talked about more haunted houses. There is, hang on. Okay, there is Haunted Indiana 3, Volume 3 from Mark Merriman. And then there is Encyclopedia of Haunted Indiana, and this is a lady that's near and dear to my heart, Nicole Kabrowski, and I hope she's listening. Yeah, she does sometimes, and there's even more books. There's Haunted Heartland. There's just all kinds of books that are involved in this. So, you read each one of them. It's kind of interesting, but unfortunately, when you read them, a lot of the stories go back to, the same thing.
Right. But the interesting thing is the hauntedhouses.com. They have a section on the Hanna House, and it's very extensive. I read through it all. And there is a section of claims, basically appearances, Yes. And a lot of those stories are from the time when the O'Briens were renting the house.
Yes.
So if you're interested in hearing what their claims were, go there. It's fun. One guy came down and was like, who's the old lady upstairs? You told me to get out. And Gladys O'Brien was like, oh, yeah, she's the former owner. She thinks she still lives here, and she doesn't like strangers.
Oh,
exactly. Yeah. So if you want to hear some of the claims from the O'Briens.
Of What Don't You Want?
What don't you want?
For those that don't know, there's a neat little movie. It's an older movie. It's got Jeff Bridges in it. It's called Hell or High Water. And there's this lady in this one bar. And I'll play this for you during the break.
It's a little steak diner.
Yeah, it's a little steak diner. It's called the T-Bone Cafe. And these two marshals, or federal marshals, go in to have dinner. And this one lady comes over, and my God, if I could find her, I'd hire her as our receptionist. And she looks at him and says, what don't you want? And the one lady says, what do you mean? Or one guy says, what do you mean? He says, well, this is T-Bone Cafe. Everybody here always orders T-bones and baked potato. So either you don't want the corn or you don't want the green beans. And she says, the only bite is different. Some asshole from New York tried to order trout. We don't sell no goddamn trout.
So what don't you want?
Yeah, so what don't you want? And they're both sitting there kind of half scared. And he says, well, I don't want the green beans. And the other one says, well, I don't want the green beans. And she says, well, okay. She says, so 2 T-bones, medium well. The one guy says, I like my steak. And she goes, that weren't a question.
I think you told me this already. Yeah.
It's hilarious to watch. And but yeah, it kind of reminds me of that. What don't you want? Yeah, get out. So, well, anybody got anything else they'd like to add?
No, I think it's one of our most well-known locations.
Yes, I would say it's definitely in the top 10, if not number 1. When people bring up haunted locations in Indiana,
it makes
the
the
Hanna House
list.
comes out and makes the list.
Yes, it does.
We're going to cite several sources here. We did a lot of, and I tell you what, never fails. Jeffrey does great research. And some of the sites we looked at, Encyclopedia of Indianapolis and newspapers.com and various podcasts. There is a lot of podcasts, some better than others. And I'm not critiquing any of them. The More Haunted Houses by Richard Winter and Nancy Osborne Ishmael. And then also we have Haunted Indiana 3 by Mark Merriman. And Encyclopedia of Haunted Indiana by Nicole Nabrowski. So those are just some of the many things we used. If you have questions, please post them on our Facebook site. And I'm going to tell you, this was a great time. I think everybody had a lot of fun in researching this. So, and if you get interested, you have questions, again, please reach out to us on our Facebook site. We have brought 2 new people on to our organization, one of which is Mia Kerr, which is our new social media manager. So if you post a question there, she'll get that. If she can't answer it, she'll get it to one of us who can. So again, a great time, and we want to thank you for listening to our podcast. At this time, I'd like to state that this episode was actually written by Jennifer Verne and myself, and it's now time for Ghost Stories of the Day with Jennifer Verne.
Today's Ghost Story of the Day, Haunted Cemeteries of Indiana, by Ashley Hood. Bridgewater Cemetery. Bridgewater Cemetery sits on a dead-end road atop a hill surrounded by farmland on all sides. At one time, the road continued east to State Road 3, but this is no longer the case, causing the cemetery to be quite isolated. This area is also steeped in legend, with stories dating to the early 1800s, claiming that this small rural burial ground as a family homestead. The long history and remote location of Bridgewater Cemetery has made it a favorite stop for teenagers and ghost hunters alike. There have been reports of cult activity in the cemetery, with visitors encountering strange individuals and, in some instances, discovering the charred remains of dissected animals on the ground. The site has long been reported by locals to be haunted, with many people claiming that it could be one of the most haunted locations in the state. EVPs have been recorded on numerous occasions on the grounds, with investigators claiming to have made contact with several different spirits, including those of a woman and various children. Orbs and ectoplasmic activity have been photographed on numerous occasions when no activity was visible to the naked eye. Some visitors have felt as though they were touched or felt a warm breath on the back of their neck. Visitors have also experienced sounds in the cemetery that cannot be explained. Strange whistling has been heard, along with yelling and screaming, the sound of laughter, and even the galloping of horses. Visitors have also reported seeing a man on horseback, although he never interacts with those in the cemetery. Sometimes it appears he is missing his head. A riderless white horse has been seen on the grounds. When approached, it will either disappear or run at full speed towards those who have witnessed it. The apparition of a night watchman, as well as that of a gentleman in a white hat, have been reported in the area. Perhaps the most active location seems to be the tree row near the Civil War era graves. This is where an entity known as Red Eyes has been encountered. Reports state that as you venture to the back of the cemetery, the temperature will drop quickly, and the tombstones nearby seem to glow. That is when you can expect to encounter Red Eyes. You will suddenly feel as though you are being watched, and then you will see them, a pair of beady red eyes, sometimes peering from behind a tombstone, and other times watching from just inside the tree row. A black figure, almost mist-like, has been seen moving about in this area. Even when attempting to leave the cemetery, visitors have experienced things they cannot explain. Upon returning to their vehicles, people have been seen handprints on the windows of their cars. Vehicles seem to be functioning properly before people enter the cemetery, seem to stall and not start. Small black objects have also been seen bouncing around vehicles as visitors attempt to exit the grounds. One thing is certain. When visiting Bridgewater Cemetery, never go alone, and always be prepared for an encounter with one of the many supernatural beings believed to inhabit the spooky location.
Thanks for listening to Ghost. Again, I'm your host, Chief Lawson. You can find Ghost to Ghost on all major formats on the 15th and 30th of the month at midnight. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, maybe have a question or subject you'd like to ask about on air or be used on the show, please email us at ghosttoghost@spiritindiana.com, ghosttoghost@spiritindiana.com. I want to thank my production staff on Spirit, Jennifer Verne, our research manager and our producer, and Heather Lawson, our trainer on Spirit and our podcast director, for helping make these podcasts possible. My chief of staff, Andrew Brooks, for his guidance and help on the scripts, and everyone else involved. Thank you so much. See you next time. Until then, stay safe and remember the truth is out there. Good night. Ghost to Ghost podcast and its contents is the property of Spirit Paranormal Ltd. All rights reserved. We welcome you to download and play the podcast and share with others for personal use. You may not, except with written permission, use or distribute its contents for commercial use. Spirit Indiana Paranormal, covering the Hoosier State since 2002, Indy's oldest parapsychology investigation group. If you're experiencing what you believe to be paranormal issues, reach out to us for help at www.spiritindiana.com or call our hotline at 317-883-9103. Again, that is www.spiritindiana.com or our hotline at 317-883-9103. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourself and the ones you love, and be safe out there.